To its further scrutiny as we go forward.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Julianne Genta.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koutou e te whare. As the Green Party spokesperson for transport, it's my pleasure to rise to take the call on the third reading of the airport's cost recovery for processing of international travellers bill. This bill has been around for quite some time. In fact, it went through the select committee process before I was elected to Parliament. I think this bill was one of the first ones that I sat down and wrote a speech for after being elected to Parliament. So that was about 2 years ago that I first sat down and looked at it. And it only has just made it to Committee of the Whole House and third reading in the year 2014, which is somewhat astonishing. But I'm sure it's for good reason, other than the government not being able to manage its legislative program. Possibly one of the reasons. I'm not sure. We support the bill. First reading speech was given by my former colleague Sue Kedgley, who's no longer now a regional councillor for Wellington, and my current colleague Gareth Hughes, who gave the second reading speech. As they made clear, and I would like to reiterate, the Green Party is supporting this bill. It's uncontroversial. It takes some positive steps in the direction of both supporting our biosecurity, which many speakers have already talked about this evening, and also we quite approve of the approach of cost recovery, that is internalizing some of the costs that would otherwise be externalized and pushed on to taxpayers of those who are traveling. So New Zealanders value our natural environment. New Zealanders really value our beautiful forests and lakes and rivers and ocean, our beaches. And I think most New Zealanders, if not all of them, do want to protect it. They recognize that there's an intrinsic value. And it's something that, hits right here in the gut. It's something that you can't really summarize or quantify in a complete way. But it is also possible to quantify the benefits, the economic benefits, some of them, of looking after biosecurity. And it's really important that this essential element of our defense against environmental degradation and ensuring that we don't introduce pests and diseases, because it's not only vital to preserving the natural environment that we value for intrinsic reasons, but it's also ensuring the continued strength of our primary production base. New Zealand's competitive advantage in the world is really its clean green brand, and much of our success overseas in selling our dairy products to China or in promoting tourism around the globe is because we are perceived to have a pristine natural environment. So it's in our economic interest to genuinely look after that environment, to invest money, if need be, in protecting the environment, and to ensure that things like biosecurity are at the forefront. But I think that this bill probably doesn't go as far as it could in looking after all of the potential ways that we could be protecting our environment, responding to the challenge of climate change, and internalizing external costs. The bill has obviously a very narrow focus. It's looking at the processing of international travelers and how we're going to fund that and ensure that we have means for funding the processing of international travelers. But there are other considerations that arise when we're thinking about how we can look after our clean green brand and protect our environment and internalize some of those external costs. And unfortunately, even though aviation has enormous benefits for humanity, and I personally have benefited greatly from the ability to travel easily and quickly between continents, it's something it's a unique privilege, really, that not many human beings have gotten to experience in the history of humanity. But unfortunately, it also has some costs, and particularly in terms of carbon emissions. It's something that may not be able to grow indefinitely. we're going to have to find alternative means of traveling, and it may take a little bit more time. We may be able to find, create alternative fuels that aren't going to have such a negative impact on the climate. But we're not going to be able to do that unless we put a proper price on carbon. It's absolutely essential that we start to put a price on the harmful emissions that are changing our climate. Because until we do that, the market is not going to respond. People are not going to come up with the alternatives. I mean, humans are incredibly innovative and able to adapt. And that's why it's so important for government policy to take the step of putting an appropriate price on carbon emissions, and that is what is going to incentivize solutions. It's going to create a market for coming up with alternative fuels that don't have such a harmful impact on the climate. Unfortunately, this government hasn't really taken steps that would ensure that there is a price on carbon. They say that they're going to respond to climate change. I have yet to see any evidence of any real national coordinated approach even to adaptation to, a changing climate, which is something that could potentially cost us if we're going to have increased flooding, increased droughts. We need to be preparing for that now and ensuring that the infrastructure that we're putting in place is infrastructure that is going to protect our communities in the future, given that we know the climate will be changing. But in addition to that, we need to do our fair share in the world of reducing carbon emissions. And the best way to do that is to, one, give people alternatives, invest in alternatives. Now, for New Zealanders, many of the trips that we make around New Zealand and internationally obviously cannot be easily replaced with another form of transport other than aviation. But most of our carbon emissions actually from transport are generated in travel in and around our towns and cities. And that's where we have the real opportunity. The government could be investing in alternatives, in safe walking and cycling and public transport, all things which not only reduce carbon emissions, but they create a more livable city for people. They reduce the money that people have to spend just to travel. Most trips at peak time are quite short distances, less than 5 kilometers, and it's entirely possible to replace those with walking, cycling, or public transport if the infrastructure is there, and it's much more affordable, obviously. On the one hand, we've got to invest in alternatives where those are available. And on the other hand, we also need to internalize the costs. As this bill, for example, internalizes the cost of international processing and puts it back onto the people who are traveling. They're the ones who have to pay for the processing. It's not the taxpayers. So should those who are generating carbon emissions and contributing to harmful climate change have to pay the price of that. And if they are facing the true cost of their choices, that enables people to weigh up the costs and make the decision that makes the most sense for them. So, for example, for me to do my job, unfortunately, at the moment, I have to fly between Auckland and Wellington because there is no alternative, really, particularly because the passenger train has now been reduced to 3 days a week. There's no overnight train. There's no high-speed train like we might have in another country. But I would happily pay that price. And if by paying that additional cost of the carbon emissions, that was going to provide the government more money to potentially invest in alternatives, that would make it easier potentially to travel without generating carbon emissions, or to invest in research into biodiesel alternatives. So, the Green Party supports this bill. We understand that it's incredibly important to look after our biosecurity. It's something that the Green Party has long championed, and it's wonderful to see it passed in the House this evening.
I call the honourable